underway, it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our session today, ASCE Texas Section Vice President for Technical Affairs-elect, Mark Boyd. Take it away, Mark.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Hi, everybody. As Mike said, that I am Mark Boyd. I'm the current VP Tech-elect. I suppose with Ron Reichert is our technical elect for the section, and he's not present on the panel today, so I suppose I'm acting as tech-elect for the first time in these webinars. Glad to be here. I am principal, and just give you a little bit of idea of who I am and what my involvement is here. I am a principal engineer and managing engineering partner of LCA Environmental Inc. I joined a few years after its founding in 1992, celebrating 30 years and counting. I have 35 years of civil and environmental engineering pollution assessment, cleanup, and prevention experience. I've also served on the adjunct faculty of the SMU Bobby B. Lyle School of Engineering for about 20 years, teaching graduate level specialty courses in groundwater pollution transport, Phaeton transport, and wastewater treatment processes. As far as my role at Texas ASCE over the years, in addition to my current position as VP Tech-elect, in part providing leadership for the efforts involved with these webinars, I have worn many hats at the branch and section, including a stint as Dallas branch president. My recent role was the chair of the lead of the 55-member committee developing Texas ASCE's 2021 infrastructure report card. Part of the reason that this particular committee was formed. My colleagues on the committee, on the present committee for reliability and resilience, Jeff Roberts and Oliver Smith will introduce themselves. Jeff was actually on my committee on the report card committee. I just wanted to say that it's been my privilege to be on board with this committee, taking on a small role, helping to develop an objective vision beyond the winter storms of 2021. We're very proud of our report, available on the section website, as it's received national acclaim from Forbes magazine, as well as positive response to the local legislative, public, and engineering community for its breadth, depth, and objectivity. This all-volunteer committee has gone to great lengths to avoid playing the blame game with an earnest effort to present a fact-based, informative product designed to point towards real solutions to the present dangerous physical and market-based weaknesses of the Texas grid that we're all painfully aware of. Could you go to slide 2, Mike, please? Thank you. I hope you find what you hear today to be informative and insightful. Our purpose is to broaden everyone's understanding and insight into the complexities involved in producing and supporting good policy to address issues we are all aware of. If you like today's presentation, wait till you see the 4 webinars we have in store for you coming up, so stay tuned. Future webinars will drill more deeply into the challenges and systemic problems and solutions related to energy, electricity, water systems and weather, telecommunications and transportation and network, and our ultimate conclusions. With that, I'm going to turn, you can see the dates for these webinars on the screen, and we would encourage you to join us during these subsequent webinars. With that, I'll turn this over to Jeff Roberts to continue today's presentation. Thanks so much for attending, and please post your questions on chat so we may address any comments and questions at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. My name is Jeff Roberts, and I'm the chairman of this committee, and I've been a member of ASCE since I was in college. I'm a civil engineer with 40 years of experience in the energy and water industry, from electricity, natural gas, water, to the liquid products sectors. During my career, I've worked with Florida Power and Light, now called NextEra, Shell Oil, Enron, and Entergy. During the past 19 years, I worked for various private equity firms, serving on 9 different boards of their portfolio investments in the energy, water, and infrastructure space, including serving as a board member for Midland Cogeneration Ventures and in the role of chairman of Integra Power, Peregrine Midstream Resources, Contanda LLC, a liquid terminal company, Innovise, and Synagro Technologies. My roles have ranged from engineering and operations to asset development, M&A, trading, and origination to executive leadership positions. I've been fortunate to both work and live overseas. This allowed me to experience firsthand a multitude of different energy markets on 5 continents across the globe and see the solutions that work and those that don't work. So let's start this complicated journey by learning about the basics. Reliability. It's the access to electricity that you need when you need it. It's simple. It's like a light switch. It's binary. It either works or it doesn't. With our world becoming increasingly electrified, the reality is that reliability and resilience will become increasingly critical. Resilience. I like to think of this as a backstop for reliability. Some have called this the Rocky factor for assets. How many punches can it take? How can it get back into the ring? It's a measure of how robust the system is to withstand shocks and continue to operate, or if it fails, to quickly recover and operate again. This means stronger infrastructure configurations and strong institutional resourcefulness by those who design, operate, and maintain them. Now we'll move on to something simple. How does the electric grid work? On a simplified basis, the grid is a network that must constantly balance between supply or generation and demand or customers. This balancing must happen on a continuous, real-time basis. To achieve this, ERCOT relies on 2 different types of generators to balance. They're dispatchable generators. Those are ones that we control. You can turn them on and off, and you can ramp them up and down as needed to help balance the system. And then there are non-dispatchable or intermittent generation. That's controlled by nature and produced when the sun is shining or the wind blowing. Their energy source is independent of system needs. As you can imagine, keeping a system like this that constantly changes in balance between shifting demand and now fluctuating supply is challenging. ERCOT now has 26 million customers and over 1,000 generators on a system to manage. 2 key indicators of the grid system getting out of balance is 1, a reduction in voltage, and 2, frequency deterioration. Voltage is critical since about 70% of the load on a typical electric system is rotating equipment driven by motors. If the voltage gets too low, motors can be permanently damaged. Frequency, a little bit different. If it gets too far out of balance, the system must shed load to try and rebalance to avoid a complete shutdown of the grid. In the winter of 2021, the grid got sufficiently out of balance that massive amounts of load had to be shed to try and restore system balance. Then, during recovery, after the peak of the storms, a variety of operating problems with generators limited the restoration of full service. Well, now that you understand the physical infrastructure, let's provide a simplified overview of the market that sits on top of the physical wires and users of the grid. ERCOT was designed as an energy-only marketplace. Generators only make money when they generate or when they produce energy. The revenue that generators can earn is driven by the marginal cost of incremental generation resources. In other words, the next most costly unit within certain administrative price caps. There is no competition for reliability or resilience. What makes this market design challenging is that subsidized intermittent generation reduces revenue for dispatchable generation, which in turn creates a problem called revenue insufficiency. This subsidization is averaging about $23 a megawatt hour, or about 50% of the price of the market during off-peak periods and about 10 to 25% of the typical summer on-peak price. Revenue insufficiency means that the owners of the asset is unable to recover the full cost to own and operate that facility. You can easily guess what happens next to decisions about incremental reliability investments in O&M, in firm fuel supply, or winterization. If the outcome of the market model is revenue insufficiency, then the reality is that the market is actually designed as a run-to-fail model. Due to chronic underinvestments, generators ran until they failed. The industry also discovered that the consequences of those failures were far worse than anyone expected. According to Wood Mackenzie, in 9 out of 10 years after the 2011 weather event, dispatchable generators were unable to earn their cost of capital. This was known by all participants in the industry. The forward markets also failed to provide support since the market never indicated that the dispatchable generator would ever earn back their capital from incremental investments in winterization and reliability. There are alternative market designs, solutions that recognize this fatal flaw in energy-only markets, and it is usually called capacity-based market. It lives by many, many different names. In this structure, dispatchable generators are compensated for reliability and resilience, and to stand ready to serve the needs of the system, whether they are actually called upon or not. It is no different than the parking lot to serve seasonal shoppers or an airport serving holiday travelers. When you need it, you need it. When the team came together, we pursued a 3-phase approach. Phase 1 was to really understand the way each infrastructure is supposed to work, kind of level set the entire team. Like most groups like this, we had a real expertise in particular silos, and we wanted to really seek a leveling of that across and between teams. In phase 2, or part of phase 1 rather, we developed a master timeline of the events, kind of what happened and when, and we went back in time. We broke the issue into 4 time buckets. What occurred prior to winter? In other words, what happened prior to December 1, 2020? This would include long-term investments and related operational and capital decisions and commercial decisions that were made prior to that period of time. Then we looked at the winter period, beginning December 1, 2020 until the end of January 2021. Now we stopped in January 21 because that was when the first, effectively on February 1, was when the first warning of the storm came in. Then it was the warning to the storm. In essence, the time from when the storm was first identified as a major risk on the horizon through the end of, through February 17th, 2021. And then lastly, after that point, it was a storm recovery and restoration. And as we already know, that is part of the test of resilience metric. The other critical piece of this is asking why. This is a stage where we could start to determine why this happened or that happened and rank the issues in relative importance or impact. As experience indicated, it wasn't just assets that failed, but rather it was a combination of people, processes, and assets that failed. At ASCE, we kept asking why, while many other groups stopped short of producing actionable recommendations. For example, it wasn't enough to identify that over 70% of the gas generation that had fuel supply problems had relied on interruptible gas transportation and or interruptible supply. What do you think will happen when you buy interruptible fuel supply during peak demand periods when transport and supply will be constrained? To get to the right answer and address the problem, we continue to ask the question, okay, so then why did this happen? In phase 3, we consolidated the information, prioritized recommendations to the top 5 issues by sector, and then integrate the individual infrastructure findings into a final report. Lastly, after releasing the report, we began an educational outreach on findings to industry participants, to legislatures, regulators, etc. To quote George Santayana, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." 1999, the energy-only market began in ERCOT. In 2011, many of us who were here remember that Texas received a wake-up call from a winter storm. Recommendations coming out of that event included weatherization, while ignoring that the energy-only market failed to economically support the investment. Unfortunately, after 2011, it appears that we went back to sleep because 10 years later in 2021, we had a statewide wake-up call with $200 to $300 billion in damage from the combination of the two storms, Uri and Viola. So then why us? Why ASCE? We are one of the few groups that are non-parochial or independent in our view, and we have infrastructure expertise. We are also the group that focuses on reliability and resilience of infrastructure. And again, as we mentioned earlier, starting in 2022, we initiated an educational campaign of the public, regulators, and members of the Texas legislature on our findings and our recommendations to improve reliability and resilience. I will now turn this over to Oliver Smith.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm Oliver Smith, a native Texan with the distinction of having been born and raised on the campus of Prairie View A&M University. I have been a civil engineer for 47 years, and I joined the American Society of Civil Engineers in my junior year of college at Michigan State University. I have worked for Exxon Company USA, BASF Corporation, Frito-Lay, CH2M Hill, and 3M in my varied experience. And I used my early experience in oil and natural gas facility construction and production operations when I decided to join the 24 volunteers who prepared the analysis and recommendations you are seeing today. I have worked throughout my career in the business, in several business environments, and guided actions to improve the reliability and resilience of the processes that enabled those businesses to deliver projects, products, and services economically and in a timely fashion. Next slide, slide 8. Let's talk about a simple complexity. Averages can be misleading. While many aspects of infrastructure are based on averages, several critical areas which routinely impact the public are based on peaks or extremes, like floods, think Eastern Kentucky, water consumption, think about Las Vegas with their issues with Lake Mead, vehicular traffic, impacts on severe weather. Now add frigid cold and blistering heat to that list. In Texas, power demands fluctuate, but in general, Texas summers have a single daily peak, which is in the mid-afternoon and early evening, while winters have 2 daily peaks, those being in the morning hours and in the evening. ERCOT's power demand model must account for both these very different extremes. Add to that the public's and businesses' expectation that electricity is always required and available, except for the periodic interruptions from natural events such as hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, major traffic incidents, when the interruption can be restored in a reasonably short and generally acceptable period of time. That expectation of availability of electricity is binary. In other words, switch it on, switch it off. Dispatchable generation, which as Jeff defined is natural gas, coal-fired, powered, hydroelectric, and nuclear power generation facilities, is typically available by ramping up generation sources in a manner consistent with the fuel sources and equipment design characteristics. It is also based on matching consumer demand within the constraints of the grid operating parameters. Intermittent generation, on the other hand, is just that, intermittent. And renewables are intermittent. Whether needed or not, if the wind is not blowing, the wind turbines do not generate power. When it is dark, The solar power systems do not generate power. Both types of renewable sources are weather dependent. While battery storage technology is continually advancing, we cannot currently store electricity in the quantities required and for the distribution duration needed. And that limits the capability of intermittent generation resources. Now, we engineers are smart technically, but like the general public, most of us have a very limited understanding of how the power grid works. At least we did until February of 2021. It is an extraordinarily complex and interdependent infrastructure system, as I have learned over the past 15 months of working with this project. All components of the grid must function all the time for the system to be as reliable as we have come to expect. Failure of one or several critical grid components can lead to a collapse of the grid over a very short period. Let's talk about the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. We've all heard a lot about ERCOT this past year, especially during weather extremes. In fact, think about the last 2 months of this summer. ERCOT is a private, membership-based 501c4 nonprofit corporation. It is not a governmental entity like the Railroad Commission of Texas or the Public Utilities Commission of Texas, though it does report to the Public Utilities Commission of Texas. ERCOT does schedule power delivery across the grid. They perform the financial settlement for competitive wholesale power, and they administer retail switching in certain competitive choice areas of the state. ERCOT is entrusted with operating the electrical power grid for approximately 90% of the Texas electrical power load. It is also an excellent and transparent source for real-time and historical power information, but you must know a little bit about how to search to find some of that data, and Jeff is going to show you a little bit about that data search activity. ERCOT relies on complex internal modeling to project power demand and coordinate power supplies delivery daily. As engineers, we have all used models to some extent. We know the limitations that modeling presents in our own areas of expertise. On the subsequent slides, Jeff will present and discuss graphical images of two weather extremes. The frigid weather February 2021 storms Uri and Viola, and our more recent hot weather extreme of July 2022. Please note the grid shortcomings, similarities between intermittent renewable power sources and dispatchable power sources for both the frigid cold and the boiling heat scenarios. We think you will see that grid response is independent of temperatures. It is dependent on weather extremes and real-time customer demand, not averages. As a consequence, the need for accurate demand modeling of both winter and summer extremes is imperative to reliability and resilience in our grid. Jeff, back to you.
Thank you, Oliver. This is an interesting and kind of a busy slide, but it starts to show the volatility that must be managed by ERCOT and gives you a single point of view on this volatility. For those of you that have found your long arms are no longer long enough to read details without glasses, the x-axis starts at the beginning of February 2021 through the end of February 2021. The y-axis is the demand served in megawatts. And then we have a buildup underneath that. Starting at the bottom is nuclear in almost looks like Aggie maroon, generally producing steadily except when they had their cooling water freeze. So you can see that little drop around the 15th of February. Next up in brown is coal-fired dispatchable generation, more units with individual unit reliability issues. Then in tan is dispatchable natural gas-fired generation, clearly showing its role as the heart of the system to help balance the system. Then we have intermittent solar in yellow, and you can clearly see kind of day when the sun is shining versus when it's nighttime. And then lastly, we have intermittent wind in green, and it is highly volatile in its output, varying from days and time of the day. Historically, as you look at this chart, you can see the burden of balancing the system, not just because demand changes, but because of changes in output of intermittent generation, which largely falls to dispatchable natural gas generation to make up. This is why the reliability of this generation resource is critical for system reliability and resilience. This is a quick look at the ERCOT frigid winter. This slide tells a similar story based on what we experienced during the Big Freeze EEA event in 2021. And this actually looks at a couple different things. On the far left, there are two sets of bar charts. The one on the left highlights the installed capacity by generation type. This is what you often read about, you often hear about. And while that is interesting, what really matters is what amount of capacity was generating when it was needed. The second bar chart, next one over, starts to tell you what the actual indicative output level was based upon those averages. So while wind had a capacity of 28,000 megawatts, effectively only 8% of it was actually generating during this winter peak period of time. Averages, basically, at the end of the day, do not matter. It's what is generating when the power is needed. Remember that flip of the switch concept, that is critical. On the right of the chart is a chart of intermittent renewable energy output for the month of February 2021. In purple is a box of the EEA event, the emergency event in ERCOT. You can clearly see that it varies a lot, from almost 60% to almost 0% of the system needs. This is kind of the nature of relying on nature. You can also observe that during the system EEA peak period of hours, it actually contributed very, very little. It also, during this period of time, lowered revenue in the ERCOT-only energy market to all generators during the other hours of the month, creating a revenue insufficiency problem for generators that support reliability. Again, averages don't matter. Are you generating when the power is needed? And how are you managing the nature of relying on nature? Next slide, please. The blistering heat, here we go. One of the things that interested us, we'd already completed the report and some of the issues that were coming up this past July, and we wanted to take a look and see, well, okay, what things have changed, what things are new, how does it look like from the summer perspective? Is the problem that we ran into just a cold issue? Like the prior slide, this is a summer snapshot of a hot summer day, a day that ERCOT was asking people to conserve. You'll note that we added a lot more generators since February 2021. We're at 1,030 generating units. Again, capacity are the charts furthest to the left. What the resources we're actually generating is in the middle. Wind contributed, again, 8% while solar contributed 81% of its capacity. You'd expect that in this particular thing because the tightest hours that we're focusing on, the 2 to 3 p.m. That was when the system really needed that source of generation. Interestingly enough, even on a summer day, on the hottest part of the summer, solar was contributing 81% of its output, while the dispatchable generation was roughly producing about 85% of its output. When and how much a resource generates is important. During the tightest hours of 7/11/2022, between 2 and 3 p.m., highlighted in yellow in the red circle outline on the chart to the right, was what wind was producing, effectively at a little bit less than 10% of its capacity. The good news is that solar was heavily contributing during this period of time, again, averaging about 81% of capacity. It's also interesting to note that at this level is below the average capacity of the dispatchable generation during the same time period. Averages don't matter. Are you generating when the power is needed? The nature of relying on nature requires revenue sufficiency for dispatchable generation. If you fail to ensure that dispatchable generation can serve as a backstop to intermittent generation, think of it as the tool that's providing resilience to the system for intermittent power, you do not and will not have a reliable or resilient system. A system that hopes for reliability and resilience in an environment of chronic revenue insufficiency has neither. It's properly referred to by another name, which can best be described simply as a run-to-fail model. Next slide, please. This is the key slide of the start of the event and highlights the consequences when you fail to prioritize what is needed for reliability and resilience. Again, this is a busy chart. The Y scale is frequency. The X scale is time from 1:23 roughly a.m. to 2:03 a.m. on February 15th, 2021. The blue line shows system frequency. In the low part of the blue line, roughly at around 1:53, you'll find a little reddish pool. This was what I would describe as our danger Will Robinson moment, when frequency dipped below lower limits. ERCOT was 4.5 minutes away from a complete failure of the grid when the entire grid, not just part of it, shuts down to protect the system and the generators. When big rotating equipment is suddenly shut down, things break. Sometimes they break with cascading consequences. When one component breaks, then cascades through downstream components. These are sometimes called liberating events, which sounds like freedom or a hope from joining the barricades at Les Mis, but it is not. And it can mean an extended repair of major equipment. Another important detail, power plants rely on taking power from the grid to restart, like a jump start or a defibrillate, in order to get rotating equipment and control and safety systems started. If the system completely fails, the consequences are dire. It would be weeks or months to restart the grid, which in turn would be complicated by interdependence between infrastructure sectors, telecommunications, relying on power, etc. We dodged the proverbial bullet and still incurred $200 to $300 billion in economic losses. Imagine for a moment how bad it could have been. I will now return you to Oliver.
Okay, slide 14. The Texas energy grid, which is separate from the two other major electrical power generation and distribution grids in the United States, mitigates against complete collapse and theoretically provides resilience, as in relatively quick restoration of power in the event of a nearly complete grid collapse, by contracting with several power generation companies to provide what we call black start generation capability. These black start generation units are required to be extremely well maintained in order to provide immediate backup for the restart of the grid in the event we experienced the sort of failure we were within 4.5 minutes of suffering on February 15th of 2021. Though they were financially compensated to a degree for this emergency restart capability, 75% of the Texas grid black start units experienced some level of disruption because of cold temperatures, and consequently were not able to function as a backstop to prevent grid collapse or provide restart generation to bring the grid back up within a relatively short period of time. Why? Insufficient compensation to achieve that 99% availability and a lack of dual fuel capability, that is, having diesel stored on site to fire the boilers and the turbines. This lack of availability of critical power generation capability would have created an untenable situation for 26 million Texans had the grid collapsed in February 2021. As we researched to understand and represent the processes that provide a system of power generation and transmission that is reliable and resilient, we crafted the energy tripod, familiar to all of you who are either professional land surveyors or who took a surveying class, to create a visual representation of the balance required. The physical infrastructure, namely digital and physical assets, on the left side leg of the tripod represent components that require maintenance and investment to remain current and capable of performing to best in class levels. The second leg on the right side of the tripod represents the regulations and rules governing the myriad of aspects associated with the elements of the Texas infrastructure tied to power generation. These have a significant impact on maintaining the balance of the tripod in ways that are much more clearly understood now in the advent of the winter storm of 2021. Finally, the marketplace is the last leg on the tripod. Buyers and sellers must have transparent and flexible methods of conducting the transfer and transport of products and services necessary for the continuous generation and distribution of electrical power. The independent construction of the Texas electrical grid means that all three legs of the tripod must be continuously adjusted to maintain level, reliable, and resilient performance. While analyzing the performance of the components that contribute to a stable, reliable, and resilient power generation and distribution grid, we became aware that the individual sectors of the infrastructure had overlooked the independence that had grown more prominent over time. In fact, the network experienced what we defined as creep, which is to say that elements of the infrastructure increasingly became mutually dependent on each other without recognizing and addressing the negative impact that the growing interdependence created. Winter storms Uri and Viola pulled back the curtain on the level of interdependence that had evolved among the key components of Texas infrastructure, namely natural gas power generation, potable water production and distribution, wastewater treatment and disposal, telecommunications, and transportation systems. The event demonstrated how this creep of interdependence led to major disruptions in services upon which the public and commerce depend for sustaining their activities. The lack of understanding and preparation addressing the creep of interdependence exacerbated the service interruptions that created perilous conditions we experienced. It is imperative that the interdependence be proactively addressed, monitored, and overcome. Any barriers to achieving this outcome, be they legislative or financial, must be painstakingly addressed continuously. Let me now summarize the results of the committee's analysis of the events tied to winter storms Uri and Viola and convey their observations associated with the factors we have previously highlighted. The interruption in the generation and distribution of electricity through the Texas grid triggered between $200 and $300 billion in economic impact and precious lives lost. Our assessment is that the application of an energy-only market in the deregulation of the Texas electrical power grid resulted in the degradation of the reliability and resilience of the grid, an unanticipated outcome exposed by increasingly severe weather events. The energy-only focus ultimately resulted in power generators underinvesting in critical aspects of physical infrastructure that sustain reliability and resilience through weather extremes. Models utilized by ERCOT to predict extreme events and provide incentive for action to mitigate potential power interruptions tended to treat average outcomes as patterns to address, rather than predicting the potential disruptions associated with extreme weather events. The low-cost centered culture over the 22 years of operating the Texas electrical grid as an energy-only marketplace ultimately weakened the resilience of the power generation infrastructure and created, as Jeff has stated, a run to failure scenario that ultimately cost Texans lives and money. Our research flagged power generators who reported issues with continuity of supply of natural gas during the winter storms. These generators, in reality, had interruptible supply agreements in place, as Jeff mentioned earlier. A lack of firm supply and firm transport arrangements for fuel gas supplies ties back to the net effect of selling power in an energy-only marketplace. If a power generator is not offered compensation in the rate structure for assuring supply of fuel gas, then they will not incur the additional costs of firm supply and firm transport. Another major interdependency that was previously only marginally acknowledged was the connection between natural gas production and electrical power production. During winter storms Uri and Viola, there was a controlled interruption of power distribution in a successful bid to prevent total collapse of the power grid. That interruption shut down a sizable portion of natural gas production, especially in the Permian Basin. These production, gathering, and processing systems had not previously registered as critical infrastructure with the Public Utilities Commission and ERCOT. Only about 100 production operations had registered as critical prior to February 2021. Today, that number stands at around 60,000 miscellaneous operations. These natural gas production facilities were unable to continue providing natural gas for power generation. That interdependence has now been recognized and is being addressed. Natural gas field production and midstream operations should not be excused from having engaged in proactive measures to prepare for and accommodate weather extremes, especially extended cold weather cycles. Field maintenance procedures involving installation of piping, meters, and valves are regularly employed by natural gas production operations in the northern states of Colorado, Wyoming, and North Dakota to sustain continuous production across winter extremes. Finally, our estimation of the impact of the rate structure for power generation and production to address the infrastructure improvements we recommend runs in the average of about a 5% increase, which amounts to $100 a year in increase for the average retail public customer. This is a small price to pay to increase reliability and resilience and thereby avoid significant financial and social impacts to the state of Texas. Jeff will now provide the 5 key recommendations that our committee presented at the culmination of our research.
You've been with us for the journey so far, and now we're reaching the key recommendation stage. On a network basis, we have 5 key recommendations. Black start generation. When all else fails, it's critical that this fail-safe backstop must be highly reliable, should be in the top decile. It should be resilient and have access to dual fuel capability with fuel stored on site. Dispatchable generation. It's been negatively impacted by regulatory flaws that have led to revenue insufficiency. This problem must be fixed. Mitigate growing interdependency between infrastructure sectors. Take tangible steps to address reliability and resilience investments needed to mitigate interdependence and avoid cascading failures across different classes of infrastructure. Number 4, to prioritize reliability and resilience-focused regulations and eliminate regulations with unintended circumstances that actually, at the end of the day, impair reliability and resilience. Lastly, reliability and resilience must be at the heart of what ERCOT does and the culture must evolve to be consistent with this mandate, from processes to model biases. For the balance of the 5 infrastructure sectors, electricity, telecommunications, water, wastewater, and stormwater, transportation, and energy, that were most impacted by winter storms Viola and Uri, we have some common thoughts, key themes from the findings and recommendations that you'll learn more about in the later webinars. But these are ones that are common across the sectors. Hardened facilities, selective redundancy, and ensure that you have continuous situational awareness of what's happening with your network when you're undergoing this type of stress. You've got to know what's going on with networks. You can't be flying blind. You need to address and proactively manage interdependent risk. Preparation. Risk reduction steps must be taken in advance, and practicing scenarios with adjacent infrastructure present and involved will improve resilience. When the natural gas industry and the electric industry run scenario stressing events and together, they're going to find out the strengths and weaknesses of each other's system and ultimately be better prepared for a winter event or a summer event. Communication. Education outreach to public and governmental agencies of what things to do and what things to avoid. Thank you for joining us on this first part of this webinar series. Hopefully, you've learned something new and has sparked some considerations for you and your business. We'd now like to turn this back over to Mark Boyd for questions.
Well, thanks, Jeff. Oliver, fantastic presentation. Expect the same in upcoming webinars, as we mentioned several times. Before I do the segue into the Q&A, I see we have some good, interesting questions, which we'll address. 2 things about Oliver's and Jeff's presentations. One is that Jeff mentioned the danger Will Robinson moment. And I don't know how many years ago I started realizing that as I said those sorts of things, I'd look out into my staff's face or audience's face and realize that nobody knew what that reference referred to. Although there is a new version of Lost in Space on Netflix. I don't know that I liked it that much, but this is the flailing accordion-armed robot with the semi-cylindrical glass head saying danger to young Mr. Will Robinson. And that, in fact, Oliver referenced this more dryly as a situation where a black start event statewide would cause an untenable situation. That would be Oliver's word. And I have to share with you before we start Q&A that this committee has seriously discussed a comparison to what we call Mad Max conditions, which is another old reference, which means post-apocalyptic conditions for millions of Texans running into weeks on end of plunged into darkness. And that's not something any of us want to consider, which is exactly why that was the #1 objective and goal that should be to restructure the system to avoid at high reliability. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention that. So I see 9 Q&A questions, 10 now. Great. Dallas May here from my office. Let's start with that one. Have either of you, and I know the answer is yes, Oliver and Jeff, have either of you met with ERCOT officials about your findings, and what kind of responses have you had from ERCOT? How did those meetings go? I think if it's okay with Jeff, Oliver could take that question.
Sure.
Well,
Oliver.
In fact, both Jeff and I have met with ERCOT's leadership, and Jeff and Les Pittman have met with members of the board of ERCOT. So with a member of the board of ERCOT. The response has been positive. They acknowledged the issues and basically conveyed that they are implementing on a concerted basis changes in the way that the grid is managed in concert with what we have recommended. Jeff, please add.
Sure, I'd agree with that. We tried very hard in the analysis and in our recommendations to not be overly prescriptive on defining this is a way you need to solve it. Rather, this is what needs to be solved. And it was certainly gratifying to see and hear the very positive and constructive feedback from members of ERCOT, as well as members of broadly industry that are participating in this marketplace, that the types of recommendations that we were making are ones that have been slowly getting incorporated into the ultimate changes and solutions to improve the reliability and resilience of ERCOT. So very, very positive feedback, and they were very constructive discussions.
All right. Moving on to the next question from my friend Otis Foster. In slide 12, it seemed wind is blamed for underproducing. Since the slide shows wind-only generation 8% of its capacity, does this statement account for the fact that ERCOT anticipates wind to not generate its capacity at certain times? In other words, was this lower output expected and accounted for by ERCOT and therefore was not expected to produce the capacity mentioned? Either one of you could take that.
I'll let Jeff handle it since
Sure.
it was his slide.
I'll jump in. A great question. The reality is wind is obviously a volatile resource. If you look and you go to the ERCOT website and you can see what the daily wind and solar output is. And one of the things you'll note by that is that if you look just at wind, it obviously produces the most during off-peak periods. It produces most in the late afternoon, overnight, and then slows down during the day itself. So some of the modeling did in fact capture a reduction in wind output. It varies by where you are. So if you're coastal wind versus further inland, you're going to have different types of capacities and availabilities. But you do get into some nuances, such as oftentimes after a very severe storm, it's usually followed by environmental factors that make it a very calm event after the storm. And so therefore, immediately following, it's not reasonable to necessarily expect that wind will be there. It's similar to what we saw in solar. During the winter, there is a slice of solar, obviously much less than what it would be during the summer. However, if you're looking to meet a peak, and if your peak occurs either in the morning before sunrise or in the evening after sunset, is it reasonable to expect that solar is contributing to meeting that peak? I don't think so. That's not to take away the fact that and this is the challenge of using averages, where you need to be looking at specifics. That's not to take away in any shape or form that solar can be there during the day. And it's just a matter of looking at it and really kind of pushing your system around the peaks when and what's available is important. And that starts to make you think a little bit differently about reliability and resilience.
All right, thanks guys. All right, next question. It's from Otis again. Slide 18, the estimate of a 5% increase to obtain reliability is phenomenal. Can you elaborate?
Oliver, you want me to take that one?
Yes, would you take that one?
I skipped the question, but go ahead and answer that one. Back to the one that I skipped.
Okay. I seem to be getting all the tough ones here, but that's good. So what we did was we looked at a lot of other markets, both in the US as well as globally, and tried to answer what is this additional capacity? What is it that is required? And we found a market that had pretty decent correlation, one that has a capacity market, one that holds generators to be accountable. If you want to be earning capacity payments in the winter, you've got to point to the fact that you have firm transportation, that you have firm fuel supply, that you've done the winterization, et cetera. And so what we did was we extrapolated that to the ERCOT market. And because the generation mix was roughly similar, it gave us a relatively decent correlation. There was some work done by some third parties as well around the issues. It happened to be PJM, which is a power pool in the Northeast. which has many aspects that are similar to what we're dealing with here. It is a larger market, so we scaled it down to our particular needs, but it was fairly representative. And then if you did kind of back of the envelope type of validation against it, you know what, that would be paying for the types of investments that you need for improved reliability and resilience, from dual fuel capability to winterization.
All right, thank you. It should take a quick answer, and then I got a very interesting one coming up after this one. Did ERCOT's last minute appeals to consumers to reduce power usage help in any meaningful way?
Yes. Yes, it did. When we met with ERCOT's leadership, they affirmed that the efforts on the part of the public did in fact take the edge off of the extreme. And this is consistent with what happens in Europe. Some European power generation operations actually control thermostats so as to slightly tweak and reduce the demand for power at certain parts of the day. And ERCOT simply asked us to do voluntarily what in Europe is done automatically. So yes, it was the request for support from the public was extraordinarily helpful.
All right, great. So here's one that actually has been a great a subject of the committee's discussion, and it requires a good answer. I know that Oliver or Jeff will provide it, because it is something the committee considered that this question would be asked, but because we're so focused on, we wish to be, as our mission, focused on reliability, and that would be to keep people from dying and getting injured during an event. Then that sort of suggests that we weren't focused on this. So the question is there a need to address the scientific consensus that fossil fuel use is creating a global warming catastrophe? It seems the ASCE report negatively depicts the contributions of wind and solar, but those sources reduce the use of fossil fuels. Is this not a significant advantage to the use of wind and solar?
I'm Jeff, you want to take a stab at that? Because I have, I'm going to base my part of the answer on what the Economist magazine stated in their assessment of the transition. And I think that what Jeff will speak to is the transition.
Yeah. From the very beginning of the study, I think there were some roads we could have taken. Like any study of this, part of what you're having to do is figure out what you're not going to be doing. Focus on the critical few. And I think a founding assumption is that energy transition is coming. It's not going to change. Timing may impact, but the reality is that energy transition is happening. The question that really was confronting us was the event itself, which was, okay, we had a weather-related event that really uncovered a problem that was there all the time, not just during weather extremes. And our focus was on, okay, what was happening? What was making this less reliable? Because at the end of the day, the acceptance by the broad population on the energy transition, there are going to be some natural concerns that they have. One is, what's the cost of it? And two, is it impacting that switch on and off? Is power available when I need it, and is it reliable? And that actually those three all go together. And so I think what ended up happening, from this is on a personal perspective, is that a lot of this transition a little bit like interdependence, especially the interdependence creep. A lot of these things were happening and changing in the market, and nobody was stepping back to remind everybody on the importance of reliability and resilience in this transition. If you want public to be, strongly supporting it, then you really want to make sure that you are managing reliability and resilience throughout. And if nothing else, if you looked at the press over the last 6 to 12 months, there have been a lot of articles about transition, both its cost as well as the reliability issue. And the challenge for us, I think, is that the consequences of poor reliability and resilience impacted those that are the most fragile, the most at risk for those types of events. So it's imperative, if we want to protect all members of society, that we need to have a reliable and resilient grid. We are in a stepping stone. We're in this transition. We just can't take our eye off the board, off the goal of doing it in a way that continues reliability and resilience.
All right. Let me skip a question again, because what you just said actually may answer this question, Jeff. Was there any analysis done on demographics of what groups of people were without power? And my take on this is that the committee certainly discussed this, considered this, studied this, but others studied it quite well. But Jeff, would you agree that the goal here is reliability and resilience for all?
Correct. Well said.
I would add, in addition to what Jeff has said, that if you want to see a report that highlights the demographics, then I would encourage you to reference the University of Houston's School of Public Affairs site, because they did that research. And when I listened to their report at the Energy Bar Association's conference around the winter storm in July, they detailed those issues. So I would refer you to the work of the University of Houston School of Public Affairs website.
Will a recording of this presentation be available on YouTube or other platform? Mike Sosa, could you address that one? You could reply to all.
All attendees will receive the recording within the next week or so, and then it will be up on the ASCE Texas section YouTube probably in the next 6 months.
Thank you. And Mike, I've got 6 more questions. I'm looking to you for a time budget on this, but we're pushing 104 right now. Another question here. Will current economic model ever allow nuclear power in Texas? I'm not sure this committee really could address that. Not sure we did the kind of research needed, but I can tell you the entire nation is still suffering from the stings of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and these nuclear power plants are more reliable than they've ever been. I'd like to see that personal. That's my personal view. What about you guys?
So from a generation standpoint, since this is a competitive generation market, I think without a streamlining of the regulatory process and maybe modularization on the nuclear side, I think nuclear is going to have a challenge attracting the capital investors needed to make it happen. Although it is a great dispatchable resource, although normally it's running flat out. And certainly high reliability, and I think ultimately is one of our long-term answers to this energy transition.
All right. Okay, here's a question. Looks like an interesting one. As an environmental engineer who thinks he understands power plants, I have always had the opinion that we need many more gas-fired power plants as soon as possible, and that the state should pave the way to expedite all the permitting. But after hearing the presentation, would that be enough to make a difference?
I'll let Jeff. Jeff is incredibly well prepared, given his experience with the the type of power generation that you're speaking of. So I'll let him speak to that.
It's a great question, and I think it's the right question to ask. I would start first with the growth of natural gas generation in North America, in the U.S. in particular, has allowed the U.S. to lead in emissions reductions over the last, call it 15 years. And it's been remarkable, exceeding, even where Europe is. And so natural gas definitely has a role. It is a great transition fuel. Natural gas plants, they are reliable. They're relatively quick to be able to install. They can deal with a variety of fuels. Expedited permitting for an actual power plant is one aspect of it. The issue is also, are you getting the support for expediting construction of pipelines, as well as upgrades to transmission systems? The other advantage of natural gas is it can be sited closer to load centers. So it actually helps with reliability of the wires, the grid itself. The question of whether we need more gas-fired generation in order, and I'm just looking at ERCOT, I think is a little more complex one, because there is more wind being added, there is more solar being added, and there are batteries being developed and added to the system as well. And I think you need to collectively look at that and come back to the reliability question. And what more do you need, and where do you need it to enhance the reliability of the system? And so I think there may be some selective opportunities for natural gas to complement what is being developed. I think there may also be some that may be designed as simple cycle, so just like a big jet engine out there, versus a more complex and more expensive but more efficient combined cycle plant. So I would suspect that there would be opportunities. The challenge has been the revenue insufficiency issue has not supported recent increased natural gas consumption. And a perfect example is about a 6-year-old plant that transferred ownership a little while ago, and it was basically a little over 50 cents on the dollar. And it's because of market conditions. That would be certainly something that would defer or deter an investor wanting to build more.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We are over time. I've got 3 more questions, and Mike has told everybody they could drop off, and the recording would be provided. Let's quickly go through these last 3, and I'll cut it off there. Does any modification to the ERCOT business model require Public Utility Commission approval?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Okay, that's a good short answer. And the second one, same questioner. I think I recall that the governor had to stop ERCOT, and this is from Lynn Clark here in the LCA office also. Got an entourage going over here. I think I recall that the governor had to stop ERCOT from selling energy across state lines during the ice storm crisis. Was this a direct result of an out-of-state grid offering to pay a premium for the energy that was just too tempting for ERCOT to resist?
That is a misnomer. The grid is separate from other grids, and ERCOT could not sell electricity outside of the grid, outside of the Texas grid. So no, ERCOT was not selling power outside of the Texas grid. We had barely enough power to keep within our own grid. So
yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. ERCOT is an isolated grid. Isolated grids on themselves are not more or less reliable. They're just different. They need to be managed differently. However, ERCOT does have several DC interties. So these are direct current versus alternating current ties to other grids outside of ERCOT. These basically will flow electrons in one direction or another. There may have been some scheduled dispatching of power to other markets. The interesting thing is that those same markets were experiencing the same type of conditions that we had. And they also had a number of plants tripping offline and had outages, et cetera. And generally around ERCOT, they are weaker in the the robustness of their transmission system. So there's relatively limited that can be done. Was there specifically a reduction in those sales? There could have been. You're asking a great question, and I would be happy to follow up.
All right, thanks. So this last one, quick answer, and then we'll kick it over to Mike for an administrative wrap up and announcements. What is the current projection on when the system would be able to meet extreme weather events, including contingencies? And we have discussed this, I know. You know, go ahead, Jeff.
It's a great question. I think we're a little bit still in the sausage making stage on the regulations supporting what needs to get done. There appears to be a general alignment among both the regulators and the regulated, which is very positive. Some of those investments are not ones that get made overnight. So for example, if you're going to put in dual fuel capability, okay, I've got capital I've got to spend, I've got to get it permitted. Help me understand also, how does the payment system work? How does that all work? And so typically that could happen relatively quickly. You've got to do some modifications to burners and things like that, to some of the control systems. But you're not just waiting till the very end. There are a whole series of changes and improvements being made, from winterization to increased levels of parties buying firm transport, for example, in anticipation of the expected outcome of the rules. So you're already seeing that in process. But if you looked at all the things that need to get done to make it, to achieve kind of the aspiration of reliability and resilience, you're probably, I'm going to guess, 18 to 24 months away.
All right, great. Jeff, Oliver, wonderful job. Thanks everybody for attending and these fantastic questions. Mike, I'll kick this over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark. Just a reminder, the certificate of attendance will be sent via email. Please give us a week or two on that. That same email will have a link to the recording in case you wanted to watch this session again. If you're interested in presenting a Texas section webinar, please email vptech@texasce.org for more information. You can also go to the webinars page on the Texas section website for a list of upcoming sessions. Also, just a quick plug, these same two gentlemen will be presenting a keynote session at CCon 2022. That's coming up in about 5 weeks. September 14 to 16 in Frisco, Texas. For more information on that, to register, to book a hotel room, it is texascecon.org.